Hello, folks, and welcome back to part two of Rachel's epic run-through of Lannes' life, part of the Marshal series here on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Just if you missed part one, it's out already. Scroll back to find it. We pick the discussion back up with Rachel and I, having talked about some of the man's exploits in Egypt.
Throughout the journey to Egypt, it's not just the army that's moving, it's of course Napoleon's, Institut Français, it's the savants, it's the experts and the philosophers and the natural scientists. So they give talks in the evening, imparting their knowledge to the soldiery. Now, Napoleon's 100% for this because he's a man who appreciates science. Lannes not a man who appreciates science, and neither is Juno. And they basically behave. We were having a talk about teaching before this recording started. They basically behave like rowdy teenage lads. And they sit and they snicker and they heckle and they make stupid comments till eventually at one point Napoleon loses his rag and he chucks Juno out. Lannes left to sit there, but he doesn't ever attempt to hide the disdain he feels for intellectuals, and tells one man that, I'd rather have 50 soldiers than one of you on this boat, till he finds the man's been in the army, at which point his manner changes on a sixpence and he goes, oh, well, that's different. Nice to meet you. So he's very, very forthright with who and what he thinks is acceptable. And I kind of admire that level of honesty. I mean, it's delivered with a bluntness that way transcends rudeness. But again, I feel like he was never anything other than himself, and people at least knew where they stood with him.
I like him. He's a rude git, and
I
and
like him too.
he's got plenty of detracting features. And I wouldn't want to be him. I wouldn't seek to emulate him. But my God, I like the guy. I can't help myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, he's not a role model to take into a classroom, but he's a role model to
God,
have on a
could you
battlefield.
imagine?
Yeah, can you imagine? Lan, the school
That'd be in the
teacher.
Daily Mail. Teacher teaches children how to swear in French.
Um, the one thing I am going to say is Lynn Bryant, who is a regular listener and a brilliant novelist. Um, a novel on Lan, please, perhaps, maybe, because there are Van Damme. So Lynn famously has a character Van Damme within her series. There are Van Damme vibes to this guy. I mean, it might actually be that perhaps she feels the two are too close to one another, but a nice novel, just kind of telling the story of Lan's life. You've got all the material right there. You don't need to make much up. That's the beauty of it. Okay. Is there anything else to say on Egypt before we talk about the return? Because he is part of the
Well,
select group.
he shows in Egypt two things. One, again, this ability to just take wounds and get up and keep going. I mean, at the siege of Acre, he picks up two severe wounds. The first one, he's shot in the face, so the bullet goes through one cheek, out the other, and takes some of his back teeth with it. So he speaks for the rest of his life with a bit of a lisp. And the second one's the one you've alluded to, where he's actually hit in the neck, during an attack, and his men keep getting shot as they're trying to save him, and eventually they just grab him by the foot and drag him off the field that way. And he wakes up and he sort of goes, "Oh, I've been bumped all over these rocks. I'm bruised all over." And Larry does the very best he can for him, but his head's left tilted to one side basically for the rest of his life. And I think in the Brigadier Gerard books, that's made an allusion to, Lannes the one with a twisted neck. I think that's how he's described off the top of my head. But yeah, but it also showed, he was also very willing, as much as he genuinely loved and respected Napoleon, he was never a yes man. And if he thought something was wrong, he said it. And, between Alexandria and Cairo, when they're running out of provisions and the weather's awful and he's starting to feel like they're being ill-treated and ill-used and sacrificed, sort of throws his hat down in the sand and starts stamping on it. Murat's also very voluble in his complaints, but when his complaints get back to Napoleon, because I'm sure it was that bastard Lannes who shopped me. So the rivalry doesn't get any better. But yeah, he gets the news while in Egypt. The that his wife's given birth, and this is what precipitates the divorce. But he is taken with Napoleon back to France, and I think again that's an indication of just how close they were because there were so many officers left behind. And he supports obviously Napoleon through the coup at Brumaire. And like all of the marshals, he was rewarded for that. But unlike most of the other marshals, the way he treats Napoleon never changes. You know, to the day he dies. Once Napoleon ceases to be their general and becomes this sort of Jove-like figure who holds France's destiny in his hand, they all go various ways. Some sort of adopt this tone of sort of reverential deference. Some become plain out obsequious. And then there's a lot of toadying for his, favour. Not with Lannes. He treated him exactly the same as the day he first met him and always used the informal tu rather than the formal vous. And he was never reprimanded. I mean, there are the stuff he gets away with. I can't believe we've gone an hour and we're only just post Egypt. But the stuff he gets away with from Napoleon, nobody else would have. Genuinely, nobody else would have. He puts up with insubordination, up with flagrant disobedience because he likes that.
It's an indication of the number of hours we spent recording that you just preempted my next question there. It's like you knew what I was going to ask next in terms of how does Napoleon respond to that, which is great because it makes my job even easier. These episodes are always such fun to record. Where to go next? We have to do the controversy next, don't we? Which is the consular guard. I will let you just tell the story because you'll tell it better than I possibly could. But I have a question within that, which is earlier you alluded to this fact that Lannes is a guy who will make his men's welfare a priority. And to some degree, that sort of feels like what happens here. Is there a clear sense that that's actually the motivation, or is there something else a little bit more unseemly? Because if you read the Chandler, and granted I only sort of flicked through it, I get the feeling he almost gets thrown under the bus with this. It sort of feels like that one time when Napoleon sort of grabs him by the scruff of the neck and goes, "No, you're not doing this," and gives him a bit of a slap.
I think it was a combo of a couple of things. I think Napoleon's orders weren't particularly clear when he said upgrade the uniforms. He sort of never specified a limit. Two, I think Lannes genuinely did want his men well equipped, but he kits them out in exceptional fashion. But I think the lack of education comes into it again. I think his financial management wasn't what it could have been had he been perhaps a little bit better educated. So he overspends his budget by 300,000 francs, which is, an astronomical sum. And when Napoleon sees, the bills for that, he loses his rag. Now, tradition has it that Lannes is snitched on by Murat and Bessières, who are very keen to see Lannes knocked down a peg, and it's Bessières who replaces him as head of the consular guard, of course, and it's a role he'd keep, in the imperial guard. But it's the one time sort of where there is a reprimand, the single time where Napoleon expresses his displeasure, and he says, "Well, you're going to have to repay this money." And Lannes just bought a house, they're just kitting out a house. And even if he'd sold it, he still couldn't have raised the funds necessary. But thankfully, he had made a friend in Augereau who had looted like there was no tomorrow and could afford to be generous. But he was, there is no doubt, an exceptionally generous friend because Lannes wasn't the only marshal he lent money to him without interest. And he promptly says, "Well, here's 300,000 francs. There you go. No interest. Pay me back when you can." So thankfully, he manages to pay off his debt, but Bessières is now head of the consular guard. And as a reward for that, he gets packed off to Portugal to be a diplomat, a role he was singularly unsuited to.
This is baffling. The idea that you would send the guy that we've just described to people for the past hour and five to be a diplomat is staggering. The one thing I suppose we are sort of skipping here is just to make a quick mention of the crossing of the Great St. Bernard Pass, which is everybody sort of talks about Napoleon and on his charger or on a donkey or whatever, crossing the Alps. But Lannes, the guy literally leading the vanguard, and
Hmm.
who's he got to work with? He's working with Murat, and this is something that we come back to, right, when they're operating together in '05, in the form of the Austerlitz campaign. They are hand in glove, and this is what I was sort of making mental notes as I was reading this, and what I can't fathom is that these two have this rivalry. And you read, it's Don Horwood, I believe, who writes the chapter on Lannes
Donald D. Howard, yeah.
in Chandler, and it's very clear that there's this rivalry. But when it comes to the battlefield, there's a maturity there that just it doesn't quite connect in my head, because I kind of have this sense that we've heard it. This is a guy who is coarse and slightly brutish, well, more than slightly brutish on occasions, and is inclined to go, well, F you. And yet, if he's going to say F you to anybody, he's going to say it to Murat, right? And Murat's not going to take it well. And yet, you stick the two of them on the battlefield, and they consistently work together and work together really well. You put the two of them together, and they're really good.
Yeah, they're a formidable partnership and they achieve brilliant things. Yeah, so they do. They pass the San Bernard Pass. Just Land distinguished himself at Aosta, and then of course there's Montebello, which is where he'd get his ducal title from. And here he works with other future Marshal Victor. He was one of Victor's sort of real friends amongst the Marshalate. Um, yeah, I mean, there are very few blemishes on Lannes' career. We could just go through the whole lot and say victory, 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 distinguished himself, picked up more wounds. But yeah, he was incredible.
Do we know why the two of them were prepared to, inverted commas, put their big boy pants on when it came to the battlefield and just get on with the task? Because these are both guys who would hold a grudge. I feel that's my read of it. Certainly, Muro was a guy to hold a grudge, and there's nothing to suggest in what I read that Lan was any less that way inclined. So,
I think on the battlefield you had to.
but some of the other marshals just aren't. I mean, you think about the marshals in Spain, and they're a pigging nightmare with one another. In terms of maturity, I don't expect this level of maturity from Murat or Lan, and they're the ones that show it. And yet, when you look at Caffarelli and Soule and Marmon, and they're all and Suchet, and they're all sort of not really working together. And you've got Joseph sort of trying to say, "Look, guys, I'm in overall command." And they're all going, get back in your box, Joseph. That's what I expect from the marshals, and I regard those guys as more mature marshals than Lan and
Um,
Murat.
well, I mean, Lamb once said if Joseph was under his command and he made a mistake, he'd arrest him on the spot. But all of the marshals behaved themselves best when Napoleon was at their back. And
That's true.
that's the problem in Spain.
That's
They
true.
all worked best. I mean, yes, Ney was erratic and Murat was touchy and vainglorious, but they all worked better when Napoleon was in overall command. Once he's removed in Spain, that's when it all goes to hell in a handbasket because suddenly they're not competing for his favour. It's who wants to be king of the hill. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, that is a really good point, and you did make that point last time. In fact, when we were talking about Ney, I should have remembered that. So apologies, folks. We rabbit holed there. Whilst we have rabbit holed, obviously you'll have seen the news about how they have gone and done the DNA analysis or whatever analysis they needed to do to prove that the guy that Rachel had quite emphatically said it's never going to have been Ney buried in that grave out in the States isn't, in fact, Ney. Because if you understand the nature of the guy, you'd know that that's not, he wouldn't have just abandoned his wife. But there you go. They've now proven what we always thought we knew, which was it's a conspiracy theory. It was never actually true.
No.
There's a small amount of smugness from me here. But Rachel, however, because she's lovely, is not being smug. Um,
It just was never believable. You know,
no,
I was put on my spot hat. It was not logical, Captain.
there we go. There we go. Be more like Spock sometimes. Um, okay, so this surprises me though. You send Lan to do a diplomatic job and you do not expect him to do it well. And yet it's painted as a great success.
I mean,
The
he does
Brit
do
the British aren't
well.
particularly happy with the outcome of Lan's work when it comes to the Portuguese because he manages to carry. I suppose it's the personality thing again. He's just got
Yeah.
that kind of dominant personality that works well, but he almost seems to wrap the Portuguese prince John around his little finger.
Mhm. Again, through sheer force of personality, I mean, there was never anybody less suited to diplomacy than that. He goes there and he is rude to everyone. I mean, outrageously rude. He doesn't want to deal with ministers. He thumbs his nose at the British. He insists on having direct access to the prince, flounces off in a huff when things don't suit him, complains endlessly. Um, De Souza, the ambassador to France, wrote to Talleyrand, how are we supposed to deal with someone like this? He starts, every discussion by making threats. He argues, what are we even supposed to do with somebody like this? At one point he took to wearing a long sword and he sort of dragged it around, so it rattled on the floor to intimidate people. The English ambassador just loathed him because, of course, he was going through all the, appropriate channels. And Lannes was getting free access to the prince. And the prince actually started to respond to that quite amiably. He ended up giving Lannes, portraits of himself. He became godfather to Lannes' second son. Um, the British ambassador claimed that Lannes left Portugal with over £1,000 worth of objet d'art that he'd been given in gifts. Legend has it that he also got 3 handfuls of diamonds, one for him, one for his wife, one for his son. So although he was like, it was beyond a bull, it was like a whole band of crazy bulls in the surf in a china shop. It worked. I mean, totally unconventional, totally at odds with everything diplomacy was supposed to be about. But he got the job done and he got access to the prince. And, he boasted afterwards, I've destroyed English interests in Portugal. Not for long, but, it was an accomplishment. So, sometimes going your own way pays off.
It certainly does. And apologies, folks, I've been a bad host and I've missed an important development in Lannes' life in the interim before he's sent off to Lisbon. He marries for the second time, doesn't
Yes.
he? So talk us through this one. Again, it sort of feels like perhaps a marriage above, inverted commas, his status. Not that I'm ever a great fan of that, but this is late 18th, early 19th century society. So status is a thing. What's this marriage like? How does it go?
Louise is 18 when she marries Lance. So this is in 1800, which would make him 31. So there's a bit of an age gap. Um, but it's a much better success this time round. She's very beautiful. Again, I think it's Madame Junot who described her as her features were a bit like a Raphael Madonna. Um, she's very devoted to her children. They have 4 sons and 1 daughter, but I mean, in very quick succession. So, um, you know, Louis Napoleon is born in 1800. Oh no, sorry, 1801. Alfred 1802, Ernest in 1803, and Gustave in 1804. Then their daughter Josephine in 1806. So I mean, she was basically
My
pregnant
word,
slash postpartum almost constantly for 7 years.
it's
And
horrendous.
that's hard going. Never mind, if though your husband was at home helping and supporting and reassuring you all the time, never mind out on the battlefield. Um, but it was certainly a much happier marriage. And of course, she became quite a good figure in society. And in Portugal, she much outshone the wife of the English ambassador because she was very elegant, she was charming, she was lovely, she was tactful, where her husband clearly wasn't. And she started to develop an ability to rein him in where needed. So it was a much better success, and Napoleon grew to like her very much as well in the end.
Well, Napoleon, again, an indication of the closeness of the relationship. Napoleon and Josephine are godparents to their firstborn, aren't they? Um, there's an interesting. You posted about this on Twitter, so I think we might, because it was amusing, so we might as well raise it. You were reading the Margaret Crizorn biography, and there was a neat little quote about one of Lannes' children. Was it the children from this marriage? And the fact that one of them goes on to marry a Brit.
Oh yeah, two of them do. So right, bear with me two shakes till that pull my quote back up. Yeah, I sort of get the vibe that Margaret Cresson is less admiring of um Louise than is was generally common at the time, because she was generally accepted to be a great beauty and very elegant and um generally well thought of by society. Whereas, I don't get the vibe that that's the opinion Margaret has. Just this is at the end of the biography, so I'm quoting verbatim. So this is from Margaret's book, which is a very engaging read, by the way. It's very, very colourful, as would suit Lannes. Fortunately, Lannes never had to see the depths, in his opinion, of course, to which his family had sunk after his death. The lovely chaste Louise spent the last years of the First Empire as Marie Louise's Lady of Honour, a role she performed with everything but honour. Instrumental in alienating the young empress from Napoleon, she exerted considerable control over this young woman, who considered her a dear friend. Worse, when the Allied army entered Paris in 1814, Louise offered her house on the Rue de Varennes to Arthur Wellesley to use as his headquarters. Before the ink was dry on Napoleon's abdication decree, she'd become a Bourbon supporter. Lannes' eldest son, Napoleon Auguste, who inherited his title, though his mother controlled the money with a tight fist for years, married an English girl. So did another one of his brothers. The third married the daughter of an emigre. Clearly, the family was going to the dogs, in this case to the Bourbons, the English, and the emigres. So it was fairly emphatic. But again, I feel like that sort of suits Lance. He was never a man to mince his words.
No, indeed. Shock, the horror of marrying a Brit. It's yeah, it's
I've
an
married an
interesting.
Englishman. They're nae bad.
Some of them are bad, present company included. Um, but your husband, I'm sure, is a delightful individual. Um, yeah, okay, so back to the land story. I guess the next significant thing is to talk about the Grand Armée, right? So we are going to kind of fast forward a little bit
Yeah.
in terms of his life. And this is, again, a staggering success story. So if people are interested in the core numbers and all the rest of it, when Napoleon puts together the Army of England, Lannes is given Fourth Corps. Then that goes on to become Fifth Corps
Fifth
with the
Corps.
Grand Armée because of the structuring of it and all the rest of it. And when it comes to Austerlitz, sure, everything is decided over the Pratzen Heights. Of course it is. But that's not to say that Lannes and Murat don't do a phenomenal job of basically making Bagration, I believe it's Bagration, isn't it? Um, yeah, yeah. Do one.
Yeah, they hold the left.
They do. And again, it's that case of it's it works. And I don't understand how these men can quite clearly have such issues with one another off of the battlefield. And I admire it. I hugely respect it. And it
Yeah,
actually
it's
tempers
professionalism.
exactly. And it's tempering my view of Murat, actually, that both of them are working together. It's staggering. And I'm just looking at the figures that are cited in Chandler, and it states, and I'm just reading directly from it, folks. I've got it open as we're doing the show. In 5 hours of fighting, Lannes' forces, supported by Murat, had cost the Russians 1,500 dead, 7 to 8,000 prisoners, 27 guns, and 2 flags. In all, the Allies lost 27,000 dead, wounded, and captured. French losses totaled 8,000. It's remarkable.
Hmm.
It,
Um, but he's very sensitive to the fact that in the bulletin that's issued after Austerlitz,
it's a good point.
he feels that um, he does not get the credit that he deserves. And his men don't get the credit that he feels they deserve. And he is so incandescent with rage that he and his men are not getting the credit that they should, that he completely just buggers off on, home. He goes off and leave. He takes unauthorized leave, authorizes his senior officers to go on leave and disappears. And it took Napoleon a couple of days to realize he was gone. He sent Murat after him, which wouldn't have been the best choice in any circumstances, but Murat just takes his time and never catches him. So Lannes goes home and has a nice little rest with his family, and he never gets any punishment for that. And Napoleon sort of just goes, "Well, that's Lannes for you. Cleared off. He's gone home. He's not happy with the bulletin."
Interestingly, though, history repeats itself, doesn't it? At Jena, in this instance, Napoleon's perhaps a little bit more effective. I mean, Murat is there stirring the pot like a, I don't know, like the one of the three witches at the start of Macbeth or something. Um, but he this time perhaps Napoleon is a little bit shrewder in terms of how he deals with it. And then, in a sort of gruff kind of way, I get the feeling that Land kind of shows what's the word I'm looking for? A not humility, magnanimity. That's the word that I'm looking for. Um, I he's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't he? There are like moments when he's a bit of a contradiction. Just when you think you've got a handle on him, he doesn't
Mm.
quite show it. So, for the detail, folks, look, go and read about what happens at Yale. Right? We haven't got the time in this show to talk through it. We've been talking for nearly an hour and a half as it is. But effectively, Lan marches his men almost to death without sleep to get there. Murat refuses to recognize how important Lan's arrival is, and Lan complains to Napoleon, who then writes to Lan and kind of apologizes and rectifies the oversight and all the rest of it. And Lan's reply is very, as I say, magnanimous. A word from you is sufficient to make the soldiers happy. That's the response of a friend right there,
Yeah, and
isn't it?
it very much is a very genuine friendship, and he writes to Louise at one point talking about how, you know, how sometimes other people intrigue to sort of make sure he doesn't get the credit or, do him harm in the emperor's eyes. But and then says, but you know how much I cared about him. So it's not a it's not a fake friendship, it's a very genuine friendship of mutual respect and admiration. And I genuinely think, platonic love. I think genuinely, take Josephine out of the equation, Napoleon loves Lannes as much as he loved any other person. I genuinely believe that. I mean, he was very fond of Bessières, he was very fond of Marmont, he was fond of Junot, but I just feel the energy was different with Lannes. I mean, none of
Mm,
the other three would have gotten away with behaving the way Lannes did.
no. Again, apologies. I'm rewinding slightly. Which number Marshal was he on the list?
Oh, that's
Um,
a good question. I don't have the list open in front of me. Give me a tick.
because
Um,
obviously he's not number one because that is Berthier, isn't it?
yeah,
Um,
Mural was two, I'm fairly certain. Um, and then Monty, was it? Just give me
I
a
was going to
sec.
say I don't remember Land being number three, and not that I. It's a long time since I looked at the order of the list of marshals. But again, it's I guess my gut would be he's easily top
One,
five.
two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10. So it's
Oh,
Berthier, Murat, Monse, Jourdan, Massena, Augereau, Bernadotte, Brune, Soult, La, Mortier, Ney, Davout, Bessières.
interesting.
I
Very
mean,
interesting.
the order was nominal. They were all
Yeah,
supposed to
of
be
course.
equals, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
But I mean, again, he was. We're sort of jumping ahead, but I'm also conscious that yeah, we have been talking for an hour and a half. But it's this. It was the same way he develops a sort of very more straightforward of hatred with Bessières, and there's not the on again, off again nature of Ramura. And he's raging when Bessières is selected to be Napoleon's sort of escort of honor at Tilsit. He hasn't even got his uniform dirty. How dare he be the one chosen? But obviously ignoring the fact that Bessières was known for having excellent manners and being very diplomatic. So if you're going, starting negotiations of that nature, probably don't bring Lamb because he's only going to cause a diplomatic incident.
Indeed, indeed. There are moments when you should deploy your LAN, and there are moments when you really shouldn't. And I think
Mm.
Napoleon read the room really quite well on that one. Um, I mean, hell, we might as well stay with 1807, mightn't we? I'm just kind of flicking through the prep and the notes that we've got. Um,
I mean, he was very, very ill at the start of 1807 with typhus. He eventually had to take a break from the battlefield because he had no option. Um, and he did take some time to recover, after which he was sent to Danzig, where he and Oudinot helped my favourite Marshal, Lefebvre, with the siege there. And there's an instance when Napoleon visits, and Lannes just releases this whole litany of complaints about this wasn't right and that wasn't right, and he was so unhappy and something needed to be done about X, Y, and Z, and the whole thing was a shambles. And eventually Napoleon turned around and said, well, go home then if you're so miserable. And it's one of the few times where Napoleon did hit back rather than just sit and listen to Lannes moan. But quick as a flash, Lannes replies with, Blacant, you need me, which was true in itself as well. I mean, he and Oudinot had a very near escape at Danzig. They were on their horses in conversation when a ricocheting ball flew into Oudinot's horse. Now, it killed the horse, ricocheted, and hit Lambert, by which time the momentum was spent. So they both had a very narrow escape. I mean, Lannes had a whole history of narrow escapes, Oudinot even more so, but that was kind of one of the ones that they'd had together. Then he leads his men at Heilsberg and pins the Russian army at Friedland. And what he accomplishes at Friedland is extraordinary. He uses his single corps as bait, and entices the Russians to battle. And they hold out, under excruciating conditions until the rest of the Grand Army arrive.
I
So
find
Friedland,
Friedland staggering, absolutely staggering. It is the epitome of what I regard as Napoleon's style of waging war.
yeah, he
But
is
it,
Napoleon's pupil.
yeah. It's that kind of spiderweb mentality that I always that's the analogy that I always use when I try and describe it. But fans of the show will know about that anyway. Um, but it's a do or die situation. I mean, he is literally waiting for the cavalry to come riding over the hill, right?
Mhm.
And it's amazing how effectively his corps manages to hold out. Because it should be just as Auerstadt should be the destruction of Davout's corps. That should be the story. Here again, a deeply
Miracle.
skilled commander manages to defy the expectation. You look at the numbers, you wargame the situation, and in any month of Sundays, you would have an outcome that's the complete inverse. Shattering of the corps, everybody killed or wounded, and then Napoleon has to withdraw and regroup. And it's not the case.
And
Um,
again, this is what elevates Lamb beyond most of the marshals is this intrinsic tactical ability to hold out on his own, to make these decisions on his own, not with, although he knew, the cavalry was coming, it wasn't Napoleon's stratagem, it was Lannes' stratagem. And that's what makes him, sort of a step above a good marshal, a good independent commander.
and again, you've sort of preempted where I was going to go
Oh,
next with it, because the immediate question then is, about where Lan has to sit in the face of being able to do what most people would frankly call a davout, right? Okay, it's not quite a davout, but nonetheless, it
Yeah.
is hugely impressive in its own right, and it's not a nay. I can't think of a situation where Ney does something of this level that in terms of an impressive feat of arms. Not to say that Ney doesn't do impressive things, but we talk about Ney all the time, right? And partly that's character. But hey, as we've just said, Lannes got plenty of character for his own.
Yeah.
So it begs the question, not only where does Lannes sit in terms of that hierarchy of marshals, and everybody kind of goes Davout, except that some people say Davout's overrated, and Suchet often gets kind of shoved up there, and all the rest of it. Is Lannes kind of top three? And if so, why don't we talk more about him? Why does he get eclipsed by your Muraz and your Nays? Because the guy's got, he seems to have it all, as far as I can make out.
He's solidly top three for me, and my top three never shifts. It's Lan, Massena, and Davout. And, all I would rank, fairly evenly, different characters, different styles, different victories, but all incredibly talented, inherently talented, natural, independent commanders. Nate and Murat are very good if you want a charge led, if you want somebody brave, if you need to inspire your men. Tactical ability, not so much. They're both very erratic. They both can, go off, jump the gun, get themselves too far. I mean, like Nate does at Jena, where Lan actually has to rescue him. That's what kind of sets him apart for me.
So where to go next? So he is in Spain
Briefly,
briefly.
yeah.
You can't help but wonder what would have happened if
Well,
Lan had been left in Spain.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, his taking of Saragossa, it is again very tactical. He takes it block by block, house by house to try and minimize the casualties in his men. I mean, he hates it. He writes Louise, give me 10 battles a day rather than this war on houses. But that tactical viewpoint, and I know we've spoken about what ifs and how much value they have to history, but had Lamb been left in Spain, would something have gone differently? Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Land versus Wellington is as interesting to me as Land versus Davos. But he's not. But in a sense, it's given the closeness and given, I mean, Land says it himself in that quote that you mentioned earlier, right? Napoleon, you need me. They seem. It's almost like Lan is Napoleon's shadow, but not in the kind of, I don't mean that in a disparaging way that we usually say, oh, you're somebody's shadow. It's they he's not quite as, it doesn't seem to be quite as indispensable as Berthier, but nonetheless, where Napoleon is, Lan isn't far behind, right? So perhaps not surprising that he ends up going with him to deal with the Austrian threat.
And that
Um,
would be his last campaign.
Indeed, indeed. Talk us through what happens.
So people say that there was a change in that about 1809. Now, how much of that is accurate and how much of that's retrospect when you know that something's happened to somebody, you look back and go, oh, they were a bit gloomy, or I think they knew it was coming. But his sort of irreverence was tempered down a little bit. He'd grown a bit more serious and he's been fanatically anti-clerical all his life. One of the things I was going to mention earlier and then didn't was when he met the Pope, rather than sort of kneeling and kissing the papal ring and generally behaving like he was given a great honour, he caused a scandal by just standing there and shaking his hand. But he'd been fanatically anti-clerical and suddenly starts, donating to churches. Josephine commented that he really didn't seem his usual self. He was very quiet and subdued, and he allegedly said he had a bad feeling about the upcoming campaign. There was just something that wasn't sitting right with him. So he took command of the Second Corps in Germany. He fought at Landshut, he fought at Eckmühl, and then there's the famous incident at Ratisbon where they need to scale the wall, and he asked for volunteers, and party after party massacred, and eventually there's no more volunteers. And he's so disgusted that nobody else will come and take the place that he says, well, fine. I was a grenadier before I was a marshal, and I still am one. So he goes to take the ladder and do it himself, and his aides are kind of going, wait, hold on, trying to restrain him. And it, again, by virtue of his own personal example, inspires the rest of the grenadiers to sort of stand up, and they do take it, and lead a successful attack. But the campaign wasn't over. We kind of come to Aspern Essling, and that was Lannes' final battle. When he'd begun his career, he trained under an officer called Pusey, and he'd been a sort of mentor for Lannes. They'd formed a friendship, and it's while he's talking to Pusey that the latter is decapitated by a cannonball. And obviously the trauma of that, witnessing your friend die in such a brutal way, had an impact on Lannes. I've neglected to mention he had the day before challenged Bessières to a duel. He managed to fit in one last argument. But he had just seen Pusey decapitated, and he's sort of overcome by shock and horror. And he sort of goes to sit down on the edge of a ditch and puts his head in his hands, and his legs are crossed, and he's sort of sitting there clearly emotionally overcome, when another cannonball strikes and it hits him where his legs are crossed. One of his kneecaps is shattered. The tendons on the other leg are torn, but he goes to try and stand up because he's been brushing off wounds all his life. And his aides kind of come to get him, and he says, well, give me a hand up, it's nothing much, I can stand. And they very quickly realise it's a lot more than that, and no, he can't stand. So he was quickly taken for medical attention. And Baron Larry, who had treated him on numerous other occasions, including saving his life on the way to Spain, amputates the leg in under 2 minutes. And as we've kind of mentioned on other shows, this is battlefield medicine. There's no painkillers, there's no anaesthetic, which Lannes bore with very much Lannes courage. And they reckon that they can leave the other leg, and they just need to sort of amputate the one. Napoleon appears and actually embraces Lannes and starts crying, because he's so overcome that this most important of friends is so severely wounded, and he's evacuated, and things generally look okay to start with. He seems to be recovering well enough. He's talking about getting back on the field. He's talking about prosthetics. He's talking about his future, but fever sets in, and he starts to. It's a protracted, drawn out death in many ways, because he's not the only marshal to die on the battlefield. Bessières is also his nemesis, is also hit by a cannonball, but he dies instantly. And Lannes' death is this sort of drawn out, protracted, feverish suffering. And on one of the occasions, when Napoleon visits him, he sort of tells him, you don't care when you lose people, you're surrounded by yes men, and you're going too far, and it's going to cost you your best friend, and sort of cautions him that he needs to think a bit more about what he's doing. And then on the 31st of May, Lannes dies, aged 40, the first of the marshalate to fall. And Napoleon is very genuinely devastated. I mean, genuinely heartbroken.
I think it's worth, if you've got it to hand, just reading that, the extract that's quoted in Chandler from Napoleon's letter to Lannes' wife, because you'll do it far better than I can.
Yeah, he wrote to Louise. He put, "My dear cousin, the Marshal died this morning from the wounds he received on the field of honour. I share your grief. I have lost the most distinguished general of my armies, my comrade in arms for 16 years, and the one I considered my best friend. His family and children will always have a special right to my protection. It is to give you my assurance of this that I wanted to write this letter to you, because I am aware that nothing can alleviate the pain you're experiencing. And it wasn't just to Louise that he wrote of his distress. I mean, he told Fouché that he'd been so saddened by Lannes' death. He wrote the same day to Josephine, telling her to try and console Madame Lannes as best she could. And he genuinely did make good on his word to her. He looked after Lannes' wife and children. And the third son, Gustave, served under Napoleon III.
It's a sad end, isn't
It
it?
is.
He's buried in Vienna, in the crypt at the Pantheon, I believe.
He was,
Or have I misunderstood that?
I thought he
Um,
was repatriated to the Pantheon. He was originally interred in, he was put at Vienna originally, then interred at Les Invalides, and then moved to the Pantheon, was my understanding.
you would
Um,
understand better than I have. I think I've probably misunderstood, but I'm just rereading Chandra as we're having this conversation. Yes, folks, I'm going to leave that in the final edit because it shows you the mayhem that goes on behind the scenes. As no, it's saying
yeah,
here, Landskopfus in the crypt at the Pantheon. Um, so yes, you're dead right.
yeah,
Um,
he was I think originally in Vienna until they moved him. Um, but yeah, he was interred in Les Invalides originally, and then afterwards he was moved to the Pantheon with much ceremony. And you can, if you Google the his tomb, he's under a canopy of tricolor flags. There's probably the most famous portrait of him is there on the right. And yeah, it's a remarkable resting place for a very remarkable man, but a sad ending and the first gap to fall in the ranks of the marshals.
he was. In terms of, I'm not going to start sort of talking about legacy because I don't think that's not Lan, and that wasn't who he was and who he even attempted to be. But in terms of the memory of the guy, my sense is always, and we touched on this earlier, my sense is that we don't really talk about Lan that much. Is that because he's the first to go? And if you agree with that kind of sentiment, that actually we don't talk about him as much as we should, what would you
Um,
encourage people to do, and how to, well, not how to think about him, but sort of in terms of how we might start to remember the guy? What would your suggestions be?
I'm not sure that he doesn't get talked about. I think it depends on some of the circles around the discussion. I think certainly in some context, because he's not on the peninsula for very long, he doesn't get the same attention as some of the peninsula marshals do in British historical circles.
Yeah.
Around the discussion about the marshals themselves, and obviously because that's basically all I talk about on Twitter, there's a lot of interaction about that. Generally, the consensus is usually top three, and he particularly, and he goes down well with women as well, and that's not to sort of trivialize or be sexist, but he's the sexy marshal. You've seen the picture. He was the most dashing. He was the best looking. Um, he does get referenced quite a lot, but I mean, there are great biographies. Read up a little bit. I think the personal connection is what I take out a lot of the reading I do in the marshals. I'm not a big visualizer of battlefields. That's going to be evidently clear if you've listened to these. That the mechanics of the battlefield isn't what draws me. It's these men's stories, their lives, their wives, their children, their passions and friendships and enmities. And there's so much that Lannes put into 40 years. And he deserves to be remembered, A, as a fantastic general, but also as this incredibly colourful guy who lived life his own way, unashamedly his own way, who never had any pretensions at grandeur, even when he became a duke, never attempted to moderate his language, never attempted to change his perception in how he regarded emigres or anything like that. He was authentically himself his entire life. And I think there's probably is something I really admire in that. And it does his charisma, I think, transcends history. It's a bit like Napoleon, like when people go, why are we still talking about Napoleon? Charisma matters. Look at the political arena we're in right now. the ability to talk to people and get them on side really, really matters. And that's why they're still so intriguing and so emotive and so interesting 200 years on.
I think what we had in that last question was an example of research bias from the host and therefore ignorance on my part. And then you responded with the eloquence that is and the passion that is so characteristic of these episodes. Rachel, as ever, thank you for such a stunning tour de force.
What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Flewick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlem, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovich. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachael Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.